Hello and welcome to a special edition of today's podcast. Now you will notice that Alex is not here. That's because I am fronting an appreciation today of a former colleague and a great friend, David Scott. Now from time to time when someone of significance passes, we're going to take time out in the podcast to reflect on an extraordinary life and assess its significance in a particular field, in this case, in the world of newspapers and broadcasting. I knew David, Alex didn't, but I know he will be watching this to learn more of this titan of the trade. Now, before I give a resume of David's career, I want to introduce two guests, or rather I want them to say a little about themselves. Fiona Ross and Scott Ferguson both worked with David and were friends for many years. So, to the introductions. Fiona.
Well, I worked with David at STV. I was the political correspondent when David came over from the BBC. I think it was about 1986 when he then turned the news operation, into a real news operation. Before that, it had been pink sofas and skateboarding ducks. So I was moved from a political programme to working directly with David on the news output covering politics.
Grand. Scott, you of course go back with David, I think, to the BBC.
Yeah, I first met David in BBC Scotland in 1985 and worked with him on a number of programmes and documentaries there, and then joined with David STV in 1986. And stayed there, and David left, I think, in 93, and I stayed with STV, and then I didn't see him, I don't think, for about 20 years because I was working overseas, and I was fortunate enough about 2 years ago to meet him when we had a splendid lunch, which I know both of you were at as well. So he was a great man and a great friend, and I really enjoyed working with him.
We're going to talk about his life and career under the newspaper years, the broadcast years, and we're going to finish with some personal reflections about David the man. Just for people and younger viewers and listeners who will not be familiar with the name, he cut his journalistic teeth in the late 1950s on the Edinburgh Dispatch. He went into the Scottish Daily Express, and we're going to talk about one or two of the stories he broke during the Express years. Joined BBC Scotland in 1968, where he was a founder member of the Reporting Scotland team, a programme that he would go on and present sometimes in the 1970s. Left the BBC in 1979, where he became the deputy news editor of the Daily Record newspaper, was the investigations editor of the Sunday Standard, which launched in 1981. That folded in 83. He went back to the BBC from 83 to 86 before being headhunted by Gus MacDonald to revamp news and current affairs at STV in 1986. So that is very, very broadly David's career. We want to drill down now into some of the stories he broke and some of the programmes that he pioneered. So let's first of all go back to the world of newspapers. And in my obit of David, I said in newspapers, he was around in the days of mass circulation when skullduggery was at the benevolent end of behaviour designed to scoop a rival. It was an era of meeting contacts in smoky pubs, eliciting information after the consumption of gargantuan qualities of alcohol, and even occasionally winkling information over a good dinner to help bloat an already fat expenses claim. Now, I don't mean this personally, Fiona, but you're the senior member on this podcast today. Take us back to that world of newspapers back in the 60s.
Well, I didn't actually work in newspapers, and certainly not in the 60s. I'm not that old, Bernard. But David used to tell stories of that time. And one of his favourite stories was, in fact, Bernard, you can remind us of the details of the case. It was a guy called Walter Scott Ellis who was up at the High Court for murder.
Indeed it was. It was 1961. Walter Scott Ellis stood trial for the murder of a taxi driver in Glasgow called John Walkinshaw. The crime took place outside the Glenwood in Castlemilk. And I think the two counsel on the case were Nicholas Fairbairn and the guy, Fiona, that went on to become the sheriff that used to do all the after-dinner speaking. J. Irvin Smith. J. Irvin Smith and J. Irvin Smith and Fairbairn were the two counsel. But this created a storm at the time, and all the tabloids wanted the interview with Walter Scott Ellis.
Well, what happened was, after the case was finished, they were all waiting outside for Walter Scott Ellis to come out. And there was what I can only describe, according to David, an unseemly punch-up between all the hacks who were trying to get hold of him to get the exclusive interview. In fact, it was so bad, I gather at least one reporter ended up in hospital. Anyway, David was working for the Express at that time, and David and I think at least one other guy from the Express somehow managed to get hold of Scott Ellis in the middle of this complete rammy and threw him into the back of a car. So they jump in the car and they're speeding off, congratulating themselves on their great scoop, when they realise they're going in the wrong direction. Because unfortunately, they hadn't got into the Daily Express car, they were in the Daily Record car.
Scott, in terms of circulation wars were a big thing in the 60s, weren't they? And crime, which I suppose was David's bag back then, these scoops really did sell papers.
Well, there's the old journalistic adage, isn't there? If it bleeds, it leads, and there was that was what newspapers and to a certain extent television was like in those days. And David was the king of investigative reporting, but also his varied career covered crime and lots of other different things as well, because he was a man of many talents, was David. But yes, and for crime to get someone like Walter Scott Ellis or the cases that he went on then to do later on, which I'm sure you'll talk about, Bernard, these were the things that circulation wars were won with. And David was very much the master at that art.
One of the big scoops was the case of Freddie Cairns. Now, Freddie Cairns stood trial for the murder of a man called Alexander Malcolmson. This was a murder in Barlinnie prison. And Cairns was acquitted of the murder of Malcolmson. And of course, in those days, the law was that if you were tried on a murder charge and you were acquitted, that was it. The Crown didn't get a second go. There was no double jeopardy back then. And having been acquitted of the murder, Cairns then went into the Daily Express offices, sat down, gave an interview to David Scott in which he admitted to the killing. He actually admitted to the killing, and the story created an absolute storm because, of course, he could not be tried a second time. And to cut a long story short, Cairns actually died before the Crown could bring a charge of perjury. But the individual that brokered the interview with Cairns was perhaps the most important professional contact in David's life, which was the late Len Murray, who unfortunately passed on the 22nd of December last year at the age of 90. You knew Len as well, Fiona. How would you assess the professional relationship between Len and David?
Well, I think the professional and the personal were very similar. It was, if you went into David's office and Len was there, and Len was perhaps legaling some story, it was a bit like a double act. Len would go through it, the story, and score out bits he didn't like, thereby ruining the entire story. And David would then look at it and say, "Yeah, but it's only advice. We don't need to listen to you." Len would then say, "Well, that would be very ill-advised." And the pair of them would then just trade ridiculous insults almost. And then invariably, though, a compromise was reached. Although I have to say, David usually got his way.
Can I just there's a story I must tell. It's just come to mind when you were telling that, Fiona, that David once told me about, where he wanted to call someone he was investigating a fraudster. And Len said to him, David, you cannot call him a fraudster because he has not been convicted of fraud. However, he has no money and he's an undischarged bankrupt. So you can't call him a fraudster, but you can call him a penniless bankrupt. And that worked.
Actually, I mean, David in the early 1960s, Len Murray defended the last teenager to be hanged in Scotland. That was Anthony Joseph Miller in the early 60s. And David was in court when Len saw the judge pronounced to doom, I think it was, when they wore the black cap. And Len was profoundly moved for the rest of his life about the hanging of this teenager, and they got to know one another very well. And they went to a party one night, and David was amazed at all these lawyers that were present. And he said to Len at the end of the evening, I've met so many people who could be great contacts. I will never remember all of their names. And when he got back to the office on the Monday, there waiting for him was a list of lawyers and the firms they worked for and their telephone numbers. And therein lies the genesis of the relationship between Len Murray and David Scott. But you would have worked with Len at STV as well, Scott. Did you see that there was a warmth in their relationship which was beyond the professional?
Very much so. I mean, and it was obviously built on that relationship in newspapers. And indeed, you know, when I worked with David, both at BBC and at STV, he was instrumental in bringing in the firm Levy McRae, which Len was, I believe, the managing partner at the time. But it wasn't just Len. There were other members of that kind of family of lawyers, Peter Watson being one. And, you know, it sometimes can be a difficult relationship between lawyers and journalists and producers and whatnot. But it never was with Len. He understood what we were trying to do, and if he found a way to help us doing it without harming the station or the newspaper in any way, then he would. But it was a very, very pleasant relationship and one that I remember fondly to this day.
Well, let's move on to the broadcasting career. He goes to the BBC in 1968. One of the great things about YouTube is that you find bits of broadcasting gold from years ago. And I didn't know this until fairly recently, and David actually never mentioned it. But being interested in politics, of course, the sort of genesis of the growth of the modern SNP is traced back to the Hamilton by-election in 1967, won by Winnie Ewing. But she lost at the 1970 general election. And on YouTube, you have the BBC's coverage of the 1970 general election. And the reporter at the Hamilton count was none other than one David Scott. And the entire two-way is there on YouTube for people to see. Now, in a sense, when you went to the BBC, Scott, his, if you like, the kind of stories that he covered very much broadened. He was still doing crime. Paddy Meehan case was the great cause celeb of the 1970s. But he did other stories as well, and I suppose was the sort of unofficial chief reporter of the BBC.
Yes, I mean, when I met him, you know, later on when I came back. I was in London for a couple of years, and I came back in '85. By which point, I mean, I had watched him on television when I was growing up. It's a bit like you, Bernard, and Colin Mackay on Ways and Means. You know, David was a figure of huge respect, and you know, and he had the radio program at the weekend, which very much set the agenda. The very feisty Call David Scott Colin program, and then he was a presenter in the newsroom. But he was a figure of such authority that he had been promised that at one point BBC Scotland would give him his own investigative series, and then he called in the chips, and they did. And he'd never produced anything before, and I'd never directed anything before, but we had been working together and developed a friendship, and he asked me to help him out. But he was that kind of person.
Before I ask you to sort of maybe detail some of the stuff that you worked on with David at the BBC. Fiona, I think you started at Radio Clyde, was it 73? So when you're starting off as a young reporter in broadcasting, he was a big figure back then, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, he did very much so. And in fact, I used to run into David because at the point when I started at Clyde, which it was actually 74, before I specialised in politics, I mean, you were just sent out to everything, murders, court cases, flower shows, you name it. And I ran into David several times. And one thing I do remember, I was sent out to do some story at Glasgow Airport. I have absolutely no idea what it was, but it was a howling gale. And I was sent out in the radio car on my own. And you had to get out of the radio car and physically pull the aerial up so that you could then transmit from the radio car. And I was having huge difficulty doing this. And to my astonishment, the person who came over and helped me was David Scott. And I always remembered that. I was from a rival organisation and I was just a wee lassie at the time.
You've never been a wee lassie, Fiona.
No, never.
I'll be talking to the pair of you afterwards.
I had mentioned in 1970, this is to emphasise the point that he did a lot more than crime. He was the network reporter at the Hamilton count at the general election. And in 1971, if you go back through all of the footage of a very important seminal moment in the industrial history of the country, the Upper Clyde shipbuilders working in 1971, David did a lot of the reporting for the BBC on UCS, which would probably normally have been given to an industrial correspondent, which he was not, but he was trusted with the story. The significance of that is because the face of UCS was Jimmy Reid at that time, a member of the Communist Party, and they forged a great friendship, so much so that when Jimmy Reid passed, David was one of the organisers of Jimmy Reid's funeral. And of course, Scott, you worked with both of them.
Yes, indeed. It was David and I used to talk about it, indeed, when we had lunch a couple of years ago after we saw each other after a long time. Remember at that time working with David and with Jimmy was the most fun we'd ever had in the years of broadcasting. The story behind it really lies in the fact that David and I had started working when I was an assistant producer at the BBC. We were doing something he was doing something, that's right, for Reporting Scotland on British nuclear test veterans. If you remember the story of Ken McGinley and Dunoon and the British veterans at the British tests in the Pacific in the 1950s. He was doing something for Rep Scott on this, and I had been working in London on that very subject for Panorama and Nationwide and whatnot. And I kind of blagged my way into George Sinclair's office, who was the head of news at the time, and said to David, you have to get me to work on this. No one knows more than this. It was the overconfidence of callow youth that made me do it. I would never think of doing anything like that now. But anyway, David liked it. We started working on this item together. He must have liked it because he then, when he was calling in his chips to get his investigative series off the ground, which he had been promised by Pat Chalmers, who was controller of BBC at the time, he asked me if I would direct the series. And George Sinclair said, are you crazy? He's never directed anything like that before. and David said, well, I've never produced anything like this before, so we'll just give it a shot and see how we got on. And the next conversation was, in the BBC Club, I think, said, let's go and see Jimmy Reid, because I got an idea, says David, that he would be the perfect person to work on this with. So we went to Jimmy's house in the West End. I'd never met him, and this was another icon of Scottish life. And we sat down, and the Reid Report was born, and that then became the 6-part series where David produced it, Jimmy presented it, and I directed it, and it did not badly.
And of course, in '86, Gus MacDonald headhunted David to be controller of news and current affairs. Scott Ferguson, Blair Jenkins, John Keane, several others made the journey from Queen Margaret Drive to Cowcaddens. Now, you were at STV at the time, Fiona, when it was known that David was coming in. What were folks saying?
Well, some of us were really excited. Others were really worried because they were about to be found out. But generally, the people who wanted to do really hard reporting were thrilled, basically. I didn't work in the newsroom. I worked on a political programme called Ways and Means, which was affectionately called Kurtz and Whey, which probably gives you an idea of, let's say, how hard-hitting it was. And I was desperate to be moved to the newsroom, and indeed was moved. He made a huge difference. And I think, I have to say at this point, there are a number of people who really owe their careers to David, particularly when he got to STV. For example, I was talking to Shireen the other day, Shireen Nanjiani, who, as you know, was the face of STV for 25 years or something. Shireen tells a wonderful story. When she started out, she was working as a junior in the newsroom. And David sidled up to her one day and said, "You'll be presenting the news tonight." And according to Shireen, she nearly had a heart attack and said, No, David, I can't. David, I can't do that. And he said, "Why not?" And she said, "Look, I can't. I've never read autocue. I've never been in a studio. Honestly, I'm just not up to that." To which David said, "If you fuck it up, you won't do it again." And of course, we know what happened. And Shireen has never forgot that. And as she said, he must have seen something in me that I couldn't see myself.
We'll talk about the legacy and programmes at STV, but now you've told that anecdote, I'm reminded I was in the door at STV just a matter of a couple of weeks, and you'll remember, Fiona, that Margaret Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister in November of 1990. This took place in the middle of a double by-election in Paisley. There was two by-elections, Paisley North, Paisley South. And on the results programmes, both STV and BBC were doing results programmes. Back in the day, the BBC used to have an exit poll even for by-elections. And David said to me, "It's about this BBC exit poll." I said, "Yes, David." He said, "We're going to broadcast it before they do." I said, "And how are we going to do that, David?" He said, "Because you're going to get it." And I found, God bless him, an inebriated BBC reporter at the chuck wagon outside Paisley Town Hall, who for a rolling sausage divulged the results of the BBC's exit poll, and David Whitten, who was our reporter at the Count, divulged them before the BBC did. That was the kind of mischief that he just loved. He just loved the idea of the scoop. But getting back to what he did at STV when you came in 86, Scott, what was the plan?
Well, it actually had been planned out at the BBC. I mean, the way it happened was that we made this series, The Rouge Report. We made another documentary about a boy called Andrew Kay, who became deaf after meningitis or an overdose of penicillin. This was a huge court case at the time. Well, the documentary about Andrew Kay and the Reed Report won lots of awards, the kind of Scottish BAFTAs as they were at the time, and David got a special award. And then Gus MacDonald's PR man at the time, I think called Brian McLaurin at STV, phoned David up because Gus had said to him, "Who is this guy who's winning all these awards? We need to talk to him." So David went off to meet Brian McLaurin and Gus MacDonald and came back the following day and said, they've asked me to go to STV as head of news. Are you coming? And I went, "Absolutely, I'm in." And so the two of us were heading off, and there was a big hush-hush. You couldn't tell anybody, obviously. We then spoke to Blair Jenkins, who Blair was working in the newsroom at the time, and he and I were producing Report in Scotland at the time. And then Blair came on board. So the plan was David would go and be the boss. I would look after current affairs and documentaries, because that's what I really wanted to do at the time. I've since learned there's no money in that, so I ended up doing something else. But that's what I was doing, current affairs and documentaries. And Blair was going to be in charge of the news. And that was the plan. And the three of us came across. David first, because he had to do that. And then Blair and I, rather theatrically, resigned on the same day to George Sinclair, the great head of news at BBC Scotland. Again, I've no idea why we did such a thing, but we did it and went across. And it was quite a remarkable place, STV, at the time, because I had not been used to that type of television. David just threw me at current affairs programmes and documentary programmes and said, Scott, go and fix it. And that's what we did. And Blair took over the news. And then gradually we built up and launched a raft of new programmes.
Everything seemed to be called Scottish as well, Fiona. There was Scottish Questions, which was a political programme, Scottish Assembly, which was a debate programme, Scottish Women, Scottish Action, which was a social affairs programme, Scottish Frontiers in Medicine. There was just, a raft of new programming, which was far edgier than what had gone before. And I remember just being amazed when I joined the company in 1990. I mean, Cowcaddens, which was a huge complex, actually, huge studio complex. There was always a hum to the production process, and David helped drive it. And then it was a world away, wasn't it, from the rather sleepy and serene atmosphere of the Ways and Means room.
Oh, yes, and you talk about Scottish, if you remember. It was really Gus MacDonald changed the name of the station, because we had been STV up to then. We then became Scottish Television, or just Scottish, and of course it's now gone back again. Oh, yeah, I mean, there was always something different happening, something new happening. And a lot of it was driven by Gus. That was the way he wanted. He wanted the television station to be absolutely identified as Scottish and be almost the Granada of the North, if you like, because he'd come from Granada. And he was more than willing to stick his neck out, do edgy stuff, take on politicians. And of course, all of that was just right up David's street. I mean, David could start a fight in an empty room.
One of the programmes that I didn't mention, because there were really literally tons of programmes, was Scottish Reporters, which I think came on stream early in 1993, and you were put in charge of that, Scott, because I remember you and I shared a porter cabin in the back car park while I was doing a documentary on Monklands Gate, as it was called back in the day. But I remember when we cut the program, David said, "I want you to go out and redo those pieces to camera." I said, "There's nothing wrong with them." What should he say? "They're not suggestive enough. We're doing a program and folk that are shady. I want you to ham it up a bit more." So I was sent out to do these pieces to camera to ham it up a bit more. But the Scottish Reporters, in a sense, his dream program, Scott.
Yeah, very
because
much.
It was just about sort of poking and prodding people that were up to no good.
There was, and just to say, I was not in charge of it. I mean, one of the great things about my life at that time was I wasn't really in charge of anything. Other people were in charge, and I was kind of sent to fix things for David. And that was my kind of role as the kind of walking hand grenade for David to go and sort out current affairs programmes. But also, Scottish Reporters was about the reporters. And you cannot mention STV or Scottish, as it was in that day, without the power that became that newsroom and the reporters in that newsroom. When you look back at some of the people that David hired, or I hired, or whatever, but very much in David's mould, the greats like, Jeff Brown, Alan Fisher, Jim Matthews. The list is endless. All of those names all worked on programmes like Scottish Reporters. And that it was meat and drink to David. To have a good journalist tell a strong story well covered by television was the ultimate for him. And that's effectively what I was tasked with doing.
And just as a final question on the STV years, is the legacy that, STV never went back to the era of soft sofas and even softer stories? Scott?
Yes, I would think so. I think one of the things that people remember, people may not remember David Scott, those who haven't been, around as long as we have. But what they will know that Scottish television remains to this day a very powerful local news organisation. Now, budgets and lives have changed since then. Back in the day of the 90s, when Gus MacDonald bought the licence for practically pennies, the quid pro quo for that was to spend huge amounts of money making a lot of programmes and a lot of current affairs and factual programming. That was the real price of the licence. And that tradition, I think, maintains to this day. I think it was at your retirement party, Bernard. I was speaking to John Mackay. I was speaking to...
Surprised you remember it.
Yes, indeed.
Either of you.
Well, I left before he did, right? I was speaking to John Mackay, who, joined STV from BBC Scotland, and I brought him down from BBC Scotland on the recommendation of my wife, who'd seen him on an afternoon bulletin. But anyway, John has been there, many years now? 30 years, something like that.
Yeah, and coming up for that, yeah.
And is, the face of Scottish of STV News. He's very much in the tradition of what David brought back in 86. All of that team were brought up in the school of David Scott broadcast journalism. And I think that remains with STV to this day.
Fiona, what do you think his legacy is in programming terms?
Very much as Scott said, but one thing I would like to say about David, working for David, David stood up for his own staff. So he would back you up. Even if you were wrong, he would shout at you in the office, but back you up publicly. But I remember on one occasion, a senior, very well-known politician who shall be nameless, decided that basically I was the enemy and had to be got rid of. So he complained endlessly, as they do, as you know. But at one point, he actually wrote to David and said that I was an absolute disgrace, shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a microphone, and he would never, ever speak to me again.
What a perceptible letter.
Yeah. Signed yours sincerely.
David called me into his office and sort of threw this letter at me and said, "What do you think of that?" And I said, "Oh," and I was slightly worried by it. And he said, "What are you worried about?" He said, "It's absolutely great." I said, "But why?" He said, "We've got it in writing. You never need to speak to that evil little shit again." And that was the view he took of it. And I said, "Are you serious?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "You're the political correspondent. If he doesn't want to talk to you, nobody talks to him. End of story." It was very funny.
Of course, we can't talk about David Scott, the man, without also mentioning his beloved wife, Liz. David retired at the very young age of 53, knocked back a lot of job offers because he was very much a family man. And Fiona, most of that retirement, if not all of it, spent with Liz.
Oh, it was. They went on these amazing holidays. Every time I met them, they were just back from somewhere or just going somewhere. David, I don't know if he'd ever been sailing before, but he certainly took up sailing then. And then the pair of them would go on walking holidays. They went to restaurants, many of them up the West Coast. As you say, they were inseparable. And latterly, when David's mobility wasn't brilliant, Liz would drive him to restaurants, deposit him in the restaurant. He would have lunch, and then she would valiantly return, maybe 6 hours later, and pick him up and take him home again. No, Liz, I don't think David wouldn't have been the person he was without Liz.
Right, David Scott, let's end this on David Scott, the man. We've talked about how he was a great figure in newspapers in the 1960s, a towering figure in television. When he became a television executive, absolutely, completely revamped the News and Current Affairs department at STV. He was always edgy, he was always hard, he was always fair, he always had a nose for the story, he always had a great desire to get the story first and to scoop the rivals, but he always did it in his own way, which was underscored with a great integrity in how he pursued his journalism. But away from that, at lunch, in the pub, when you weren't always talking about the job, David Scott, the man. Scott, your memories of David the man.
I just think he was inspirational. You know, I mean, there are very few people you meet in your life who transform careers. Now, Fiona mentioned it earlier on. David transformed my career. I wouldn't have had a career like I have had in television had I not worked with David back in 1985. But there's so many people like that. He was driven in the sense that he wanted things to be good, but he was incredibly fair if you needed a bit of help. And he was very helpful and very influential in my life and very many people. And you know that from speaking to other people in newspapers and television, what it was like. I only ever saw him hugely disappointed once. And fortunately, it was nothing to do with me. It was when Hearts didn't actually win the league, if you remember, Bernard. I think it was Celtic. You may remember this.
Now, let me just, because I'm always one to get my statistics right. It was the end of the season, 1985-86. Celtic were winning 5-0 at Love Street. Hearts needed a point at Dens Park in Dundee. And after 79 minutes, Dundee made a substitution. Albert Kidd came on. Albert Kidd scored 2 goals. That season, Hearts and Celtic ended up with 50 points apiece. The 5-0 victory for Celtic down in Love Street meant that they won the league on goal difference. Hearts were denied the championship.
And that's when I saw David at his most disappointed, as a lifelong Hearts fan. But he was funny, he was good-humoured, he could be gruff when he needed to be, he could be incredibly friendly when he needed to be. There was a mixed tapestry with David, but he was fiercely loyal, and we hadn't spoken for many, many years because I'd been away working overseas. But when I came back, it was like we hadn't spoken for 2 weeks or something. It was just exactly the same. And you were there when he and I met for the first time in 20 years. It was quite Glaswegians and Edinburgh folk are not used to emotion, but it was a little bit slightly emotive in the fact that we had seen each other for 20 years and came back together. But he was a great man, and sadly and sorely missed. There'll not be many like him again, if any.
Fiona?
One of the things that struck me about David was he never forgot his friends. He acquired friends through every stage of his career, and he kept in touch with them all. And he went out of his way to keep in touch with them all. And he was, yes, lunch with David was, well, frankly, dangerous. There was a good chance you would go home in an ambulance. It was...
or stay for dinner.
Yes, or stay for dinner.
Yes. Yes, I can remember several lunches starting at about midday and getting home at about 10 o'clock at night. But he was very good at reminiscing, but he wasn't the hero of every story. He was very entertaining, telling stories against himself, as well as everything else. But a lot of people, as I said before, they owe their careers to him. Not just they owe their careers to his style of broadcasting and reporting, but also to his intervention and the fact that he, if not some of them he promoted, most of them he just encouraged and made you believe you could do things that you didn't realize you could do.
Well, I'd like to end just on the sort of closing paragraphs of my obituary of David, just by way of paying tribute. When I say, in retirement, he was a near permanent figure in the hostelries of Glasgow's West End and was a fantastic lunch companion where his astonishing recall for stories of the past transported his companions back to another era. He never embellished a story or over-exaggerated his role in it. He kept up to date with everything, and if you were working on something that interested him, you got that genteel interrogation and the inevitable question that unlocks the story. Why? David was a brilliant reporter and an exacting but fair boss. He was a family man, a man of many friends, contacts, and acquaintances. Professionally, he was very much of his age in that bygone world of proper scoops. David had a perceptible presence, even when he wasn't speaking. His stature, anchored in the brilliance of his career, was elevated by the warmth of his ever-curious personality. Those privileged to have known it will simply never forget it. And I'd like to thank both Scott and Fiona for joining me on this podcast. When we next meet for lunch, the first thing we will do is to raise a glass and to toast our friend David Scott.